So, good afternoon, good morning, or indeed good evening, depending on where in the world you join us today. My name is Dr. Shane Bergin, and it is a great pleasure of mine to welcome you back to the PERITIA lecture series on policy, expertise, and trust. We are joined today by a wonderful professor from Canada, Professor Goldenberg, and she will be kicking off the second part of our lecture series today. Apologies to those of you who had hoped to hear Asa 2 weeks ago. Of course, her lecture had to be postponed, and we'll be in touch with you to reschedule that later in the term. So just to take a step back, perhaps this is your first time to attend a PERITIA lecture. I'll give you a little bit of context. So trust and truth, as I'm sure many of you would agree, have become contentious topics for science and indeed democracy. Conspiracy theories are now disrupting our political elections. Disinformation campaigns are targeting the scientific consensus around issues such as climate change, vaccines, which you'll hear about today, and indeed an anti-elite populism overshadows many public debates. So in the midst of this pandemic, citizens are maybe finding themselves asking the quintessential philosophical questions: what truth is, indeed, who can we trust, or indeed, how can we trust? And this is what PERITIA wishes to get involved in and to delve into through these lecture series. So we have a range of prominent philosophers and academics from Europe and indeed from North America coming together to talk to you about their research and their thoughts on those broad things. Our lecture series is sponsored by the UCD, that's University College Dublin Centre for Ethics in Public Life, also by the American University of Armenia, and it's all associated, as I said, with PERITIA. For those of you who are joining and wish to hear our presentation today in Armenian, there is a translation service. There will also be a recording of this presentation available on YouTube after we finish today. So as I mentioned a moment ago, our lecture today is given by Maya J. Goldenberg from the University of Guelph in Ontario, Canada. And she'll be asking the question, a war on science, the death of expertise. And I suppose in answering that, she's going to ask us to rethink vaccine hesitancy. And I'm very much looking forward to this talk. Professor Goldenberg is an associate professor of philosophy at the University of Guelph, as I said, and she is a philosopher of science and of medicine there. And I would really recommend, if you're interested in today's talk, in going and buying her recently published book, Vaccine Hesitancy, Public Trust, Expertise, and the War on Science, published by Pittsburgh Press. It's a fantastically compelling piece of work, and I think very, very relevant for the times we live in. As with previous lectures in this series, there is an opportunity for you to ask questions, and we will do our best to put those questions to Professor Goldenberg after her presentation, and she'll interact with your ideas. I would ask, mainly in my own benefit of being able to kind of read and listen at the same time, I would ask that you write concise questions and that you try and get to the point, and that there's a question mark as soon as possible in your question. And I'll do my best to put those ones to the professor today. I can guarantee you the long ones that take a little bit of interpretation are the ones that unfortunately I put to the bottom of the list. We do wish we could invite you to ask those questions directly, but I suppose we just can't do that at the moment. So without further ado, I'm going to hand you over to Professor Goldenberg, who will present her thoughts to you. Please do use the questions and answers function at the bottom of the screen, and I'll be back after the presentation to put your questions to Professor Goldenberg. So Professor Goldenberg, it's over to you.
Thank you so much, Shane, and thank you everyone for being here. I'll just get my slides started. Good. It is, as I just said, it's an honor to be here. I'm a big supporter and reader of PERITIA's work and love this lecture series. So thank you for letting me be a part of it too. I'll start, I guess, with my work on vaccine hesitancy. I started this a few years ago. So my work started with interest in the controversy surrounding childhood vaccines. That, of course, gets no attention now, but we will be back there soon, I believe, as many well visits, as we call them, for children have been missed during the time of COVID. And we're going to struggle to sort of catch up children on their childhood vaccines. So it was specifically my interest, as a philosopher of science. There were many questions to ask, but the question that was interesting to me was the situation in industrialized nations. The puzzle here is that against a strong scientific consensus on vaccines, which is consistently messaged to the public, or I'll say at least very consistently messaged, and relatively good access afforded by the citizens of these countries, vaccine hesitancy still persists. So when I started, I wanted to figure out what evidence is going to convince these people. That was my starting question. And that turned out to be the wrong question. And it was when I realized that the research started to get more interesting. If vaccine hesitancy isn't an information problem, and I'm going to suggest that that's part of it, or a communication problem, then what is it? So I was almost finished the book manuscript that Shane nicely told you about when COVID emerged. But the themes that I had taken up in my study of vaccine hesitancy or pediatric vaccine hesitancy were centered around public trust in scientific institutions and the problem of expertise. And I think those themes are as relevant as ever as we direct our attention towards COVID vaccine hesitancy. So the arguments I offered were first against the dominant thinking about vaccine hesitancy. So I argued against the popular view that vaccine hesitancy stems from some members of the public problematic understanding of and appreciation of science. So poor scientific literacy, even science denialism are often thought to be the cause of vaccine hesitancy. And I reject that view. I also argued against the widely held view that vaccine hesitancy in industrialized nations is a problem of affluence. Specifically, the profile of vaccine hesitators is white and affluent people. There is good reason to think otherwise and to do the empirical research to establish this. So I see, as a whole, I see vaccine hesitancy as a bellwether or an indicator of social fracture. And the COVID situation actually throws some of these signs and symptoms into sharper relief. So today for this talk, I'm going to focus on the first argument on your screen here, that vaccine hesitancy does not signal a problem of the public's scientific misunderstanding or science denialism or some kind of war on science and expertise. The second point is implicated by this argument against the war on science, but I won't be able to give that second point the attention it deserves. Still, I'd be happy to go into it during the question and answer period. Okay, so let's start first with the definition of vaccine hesitancy. It is widely understood to be a feeling of ambivalence about vaccines or vaccination. To be clear, it is an attitude, it is not a behavior. The behavior of interest might be vaccine refusal. And of course, vaccine hesitancy, this attitude can predict behavior, but it doesn't guarantee it. Some people hesitate but still vaccinate according to recommendations. Others hesitate and refuse all vaccines. And some have tried to modify schedules for their children where you do some vaccines, you skip others, you space them out longer, you start kids when they're older. We usually call those alternative schedules. Public health scholars agree that we need to keep an eye on the attitude, not just the behavior, in order to protect public health. And this point of interest led to the formation of a SAGE group, a scientific advisory group of experts at the WHO, focused exclusively on vaccine hesitancy in 2012. What I want to do today is challenge the way we usually think about or frame vaccine hesitancy and refusal. Frameworks, of course, are important. They structure how we view the problem, how we respond to it. So I'd like to look at and assess the assumptions and values that lie beneath the dominant framework. I call the dominant framework the war on science. I didn't make up that term, but it fits what I'm trying to characterize here. And I'll suggest a new framework. My preferred framework is a crisis of trust. So let's start thinking about how should we understand public resistance and controversy over scientific claims. So these controversies over things like vaccines, climate change, GMOs, they are usually framed in combative terms. The combatants are science versus nonsense, reason versus ignorance, expertise versus non-expertise. And we hear that science, rationality, and expertise are losing the war. And of course, there are victims of any conflict, and the victims here are public health and well-being. And when we ask who is responsible for this, people usually point at the public, at least those members of the public who turn away from science and rationality by refusing vaccination or by deprioritizing political action on climate change. And because in those actions, they fail at the task of informed democratic participation. That's the dominant view. You see this routinely in many forms of media attending to public resistance to scientific claims. This is, of course, a very well-traversed topic. Why do the public resist scientific claims? In my own research, I looked at academic work, popular science writing, opinion pieces in newspapers and magazines, and there were some clear themes that emerged. Commentators would commonly bemoan scientific illiteracy among the general public. So this is just one example on your screen, a popular science book, How Scientific Illiteracy Threatens Our Future. And of course, the end of expertise is a dominant theme too. That's the idea that no one listens to experts anymore. So these are very common, as I mentioned. All the discussions around public resistance to scientific claims just rehashes these themes again and again. And this public resistance towards even very strong scientific consensus claims are seen as key problems of our time. We're now allegedly post-truth, post-fact. We are anti-science. This is the world that we live in. And and of course, the culture war on science and expertise only gets amplified when you add a pandemic. COVID-19 was described in this public health paper as our first post-truth pandemic. With its accompanying infodemic, as the WHO called it, we've got this rampant problem of false information. So what's being described here as a whole is a culture war on science and expertise. It's taking place on social media platforms. It's impacting us all. That's the dominant framework. And I want to challenge some parts of this framework regarding vaccine hesitancy, and even it pertains to public resistance to scientific claims more generally. So returning to that previous division, I'm going to argue that we are not in a war on science and expertise. I will acknowledge that it is tempting to see it that way when members of the public repeat pseudoscience that they pick up on the internet, when they don't listen to their doctors about vaccines. But I'll make the alternative the case for an alternative framework, the war on science, which is a crisis of trust, specifically public mistrust of scientific institutions. That's what I think is the problem here. So this alternative framework, this crisis of trust, it rests on a different conception of the relationship between science and society. What is this thing called science? How do the publics relate to science? And this differently posited relationship encourages different public health outreach strategies. It also redraws the lines of moral responsibility for the problem. So specifically by that, I mean the problem no longer lies squarely in the epistemic failings of the public. So let's start with what I mean by the nature of science, and of course, and the role it plays in politics and policy. So in the war on science, you may think that the driver of vaccine hesitancy and refusal is the public's low scientific literacy, or possibly some kind of willful science denialism and anti-expertise. And these explanations share something in common, namely a grounding assumption about the role of science in democratic decision-making. In both accounts, you've got this thing called science. It transcends partisan politics, and a failure to recognize this rightful anchor in liberal democracies is damaging. So I use this image on your screen of a boat and an anchor to capture that assumed role of science in democratic society. Here, science provides the anchor for the swells and surges of democratic choice. It rationalizes majority rule, and public misunderstanding and death of expertise similarly hurt this relationship because they untether decision-making from its rational basis. So whether it's a war on evidence, a war on experts, public resistance to scientific claims is similarly envisioned. It's a battle between established knowledge and everything else. Now, public health organizations often have good scientific backing for their directives. It's then assumed to follow from this that public health has exclusive claim to knowledge and to rational policy. It is also assumed that the problem lies in those who cannot appreciate the science and the science-backed policies. What I just described is the thinking about vaccine hesitancy and other forms of public pushback against these scientifically backed policies. So I would like to agree to the scientific superiority of the vaccine consensus view, but I'm going to challenge the other claims. First, that the best policies follow from the best science, and that the public are the problem. So I've already said it, that I am working against a popular and admittedly tempting way of thinking about controversies over well-established scientific claims. That this idea that disagreements over, let's say, vaccine safety represents a war over scientific evidence. It is a very widely held view. It is a common perception, common enough to make the cover of National Geographic magazine, and it is repeated by leaders who feel the need to declare allegiance to science. Just quick example, here's the former head of the CDC, tearily vowing to uphold science. Politicians like Hillary Clinton and Justin Trudeau, my own prime minister, have come out to express allegiance to science. They join marches for science, and so on. So I say this view is tempting because in some ways the description seems to fit. We've got this huge body of literature supporting a scientific consensus. We've got opponents who pick out selective and often disreputable counter evidence. The publics are caught in the middle, and they often, or at least sometimes, choose wrongly. So the reason for public resistance to scientific claims like vaccines or climate change is argued to be that the public misunderstands the science, or they lack scientific, they lack sufficient scientific literacy. And popular science communicators strongly endorse this view. Here's an image of Neil deGrasse Tyson, probably the most well-known English language science communicator, saying, "Scientific illiteracy is a tragedy of our times." And he does this. He did this on a television show with reference to vaccine hesitators, as long as other science transgressors. So as a result of this kind of view, science communications tends to focus on knowledge transmission, especially debunking myths. Here, I just wanted to show you a few examples that largely represent what vaccine communications to the public look like. The common themes are fact versus myth, getting the facts, just the facts, or this clever inoculation against misinformation. Of course, parents do seem to be rejecting science when they explain their reasons for hesitating about vaccines. There's lots of surveys, interview transcripts from many, many countries where parents say things like, vaccines are not safe, vaccines aren't effective, vaccines aren't necessary. So in their protests, they make evidentiary claims in direct contradiction to the consistent messaging offered by their physicians, by public health agencies, and so on. So the framework, for those reasons, seems compelling. Yet there is still strong reasons to challenge this pervasive explanation that the public doesn't understand the science. If misunderstanding and misinformation and misinterpretation of scientific evidence were the problem, providing accurate information and education should correct this. And for the most part, it doesn't. There have been years of well-funded education campaigns, and they have not changed the number of vaccine refusers. Vaccine hesitancy numbers are even going up around pediatric vaccines, slowly, but upward. Another reason to think that poor literacy is not the root of the problem is that vaccine hesitators are often well-educated. Social science research has found higher vaccine hesitancy among university degree holders, even postgraduate. The more likely story is that those with higher education are putting their critical thinking skills to use. Some are reading the scientific papers, and many more are allegedly reading between the lines to see what the establishment doesn't want them to see. So even if we allow for a few missteps in individual reasoning, cherry picking the data, misattributing correlation for causation, poor scientific literacy is not the key problem driving vaccine hesitancy. Now, some war on science type explanations of vaccine hesitancy go even stronger than the presumed knowledge deficit that I just described. They say education efforts are not lowering vaccine hesitancy because vaccine hesitators cannot be reasoned with. It's a lost cause, and compulsion is the only way. The war on science has also been parsed out as the death of expertise. That term, the death of expertise, comes from this book in the center of your screen, 2018 book by political scientist Tom Nichols. It made it to the New York Times bestseller list. So apparently convincing was his position that no one listens to experts anymore. So in this book, he laments the real-time realization of the Dunning-Kruger effect, where the public think they know better than experts. And because of that, science denialism and irrationalism can then thrive. Now, moving away from popular science and politics writing to the academic text, we look towards science and technology studies. That should be informative because it researches these very questions about the nature of science, its relationship to society, and of course, the status of scientific experts. It actually surprised me to see some science studies scholars take up some form of this narrative of science denialism and the public embrace of irrationalism. And that, of course, is consistent with the war on science framework. The scholars in science studies come at it in a few ways. A number of prominent thinkers in the fields, including Latour and Kitcher and Collins, have recently wondered if the discipline's 50-something years of critical science studies that have showed the extent to which science is socially constructed might have contributed to this current frustrating situation where scientific experts are seen as no more reliable than non-experts, and everybody's kind of got a point. None of them end up fully blaming STS. In fact, they want to use STS to solve the problem, but they do agree that science and experts are no longer given the respect they deserve. I'll give you an example with sociologists Harry Collins and Robert Evans. They've worked rigorously on this problem of expertise. They wrote Rethinking Expertise to address this very problem of the downgrading of experts. And of course, they wanted to reclaim the status of expertise. Collins then wrote a popular science book called Are We All Scientific Experts Now?, which sort of rehashes the 2008 book's arguments. And in it, he coined the phrase default expertise. This is the problematic idea that everyone is an expert or no one is an expert. Instead, we've got this leveling of epistemic expertise. Now, default expertise is meant to, I'm quoting Collins, describe the sense of empowerment, the sense that every citizen is part of the game of science and technology. It is the feeling of right to judge that ordinary citizens think they possess because science and technology are so fallible. So default expertise is supposed to explain the apparent reasonableness of telling worried parents to do the research and decide for yourself, and the energy with which some vaccine hesitators take up that challenge. So Collins wants to save sociology of science as much as he wants to save expertise. So he provides a response to those armchair researchers or default experts investigating their children's vaccine schedule. He draws from the periodic table of expertises that he developed with Evans in that book I mentioned earlier. It details the many kinds of expertise that are available to us. And he contrasts between two key kinds of expertise: primary source knowledge and interactional expertise. Those are the ones circled on your screen. Primary source knowledge confers the kind of expertise that an informed non-specialist can gain from reading scientific papers, the primary sources. Interactional expertise is specialist expertise. It's the knowledge and understanding that comes from being part of the specialist community. So a parent who's well-read because they access scientific papers can have this primary source knowledge expertise on vaccines, but this is different from interactional expertise, which they don't have. That is garnered only by those who are members of the relevant expert community. Only this expertise gives you specialist knowledge or specialist tacit knowledge required to pronounce on the knowledge claim in question. So the upshot, according to Collins, is you can read all the online stuff you want, or even read the professional literature from the perspective of an outsider or an amateur. You'll absorb a lot of information, but you'll still never have interactional expertise. The sort of expertise developed by getting to know a community of scientists intimately and getting a feeling for what they think. So Collins explains further. He says, if you get your information only from the journals, you can't tell whether a paper is being taken seriously by the scientific community or not. You can't get a good picture of what is going on in science from the literature alone. So Collins' answer to the question, are we all scientific experts now, is no. And interactional expertise is the key concept in explaining this. Even if everyone is an expert at some things, that doesn't confer specialist knowledge on everyone. Vaccine skeptics will often insist that they are experts on their children, but that doesn't make them experts on vaccines, Collins would argue. Specialist knowledge only arises from education and work and immersion in the community of experts. So you're best to leave the judgments of vaccine safety and efficacy to the scientists. So this is how these leading sociologists of expertise reclaim expertise. They say scientists can do better in their communications and in their policing of occasional transgressions like fraud and various kinds of misrepresentation. But the heart of the problem lies in the public's confusion about the nature of expertise. Once the publics understand that we are not all scientific experts, expertise will be restored and public controversy over scientific claims can end. So the knowledge deficit is thereby filled in that way with this better understanding of the nature of expertise. Now, in this argument that Collins offers for the special nature of interactional expertise is acknowledgement that knowledge arises in communities. This idea that knowledge is social, that science is social knowledge, is a claim that is key to social epistemology. Which is an area that I work in. I think Collins' acknowledgement of the social nature of scientific knowledge is right, but it doesn't go far enough. A key feature of this communal or social exercise of knowledge building is trust. And that is the case because all relationships are built on trust. So I want to direct you towards attending to the ways trust figures into that social exercise of knowledge building. And doing that gets me to my preferred framework, the crisis of trust. So I want to take this picture of science as a community of knowers, something that Collins and sociologists confidently subscribe to. I want to take that picture in a different direction. I'm going to characterize public resistance to science and the so-called death of expertise differently. I'm going to say that it is not a move towards irrationality or a reflection of scientific misunderstanding or really a war on anything, but rather mistrust of scientific institutions and what follows from there. So to make the case that the problem is poor trust and not poor regard of science, I need to direct your attention to how science and trust are linked. Trust is endemic to science. It figures into knowledge creation, into managing dissent and disagreement, into consensus building, and of course, the legitimation of the consensus. Poor trust relations undermines scientific practice and policy. So in short, trust pervades all areas of science. Vaccine hesitancy then is a symptom of a trust deficit, specifically poor public trust in medical and scientific institutions and the government organizations too. Because these institutions need public trust to achieve their mandates, public resistance to scientific claims is not squarely a problem with the publics, but a problem with scientific governance. And that invites new ways of addressing vaccine hesitancy. So that's a summary of what I'm going to argue. And now I'll get into it with, first of all, what do we mean by the word trust? It is a heavily theorized concept in ethics, philosophy of science, in social theory. There's particularly good attention provided by feminist theorists in all of these domains. Feminist research focuses on relational aspects of morality, of knowledge production, and of course, social structures, especially relationships involving imbalances of power between participants. So feminist research is particularly good on trust for that reason. The concept of trust is taken to mean having confidence in someone or something. When we talk about trust in the context of science, we're usually talking about epistemic trust. When you invest epistemic trust in someone, you trust them in their capacity as providers of knowledge or information. When we trust a person, we can also trust an organization or an institution. We're judging them to be dependable and worthy of our confidence. Now, trusting others is risky. Trusting others is also unavoidable. And this tension invites ethical analysis. When we find ourselves in situations where we lack adequate information to know for ourselves, and this happens often, every day even, we need to trust others. But we know that there's risk. We know that this trust may be broken. So because of this, trust requires what's been described in the sociology literature as leaps of faith. This is influenced by the work of George Simmel. This leap of faith refers to a necessary bridging of an information gap in situations of risk. So epistemically dependent people will fill any perceived knowledge gap with a kind of suspension or bracketing off of uncertainties. And the confidence with which the trustee leaps is captured in the expectation of the trusted expert's goodwill, or at least their moral integrity. There's an additional expectation that the expert will be properly motivated to act. So confidence in experts hinges on their moral character, not just their epistemic credentials. There's been qualitative research into parental decision-making regarding vaccines that actually highlight these leaps of faith taken in the face of incomplete knowledge and future unknowns. On vaccines, parents tend to get advice from relations of familiarity. They'll look to their peers, their family members, health professionals, and trusting leaps are then either taken or denied. Trust is therefore understood as a means of social cohesion or connection, following Barbara Mistal on that. And that connection comes through affective commitments or emotional ties. So all this about trust, what's important for our discussion is that it is not the growing mountain of data that are convincing parents to vaccinate their children, but a willing leap in favor of the scientific consensus. Vaccine hesitators and refusers situate themselves in different spheres of familiarity that disqualify the majority view on vaccines. So there's actually a symmetry between the two. It's not that one side is informed and the other side is uninformed. One side is scientifically literate, the other one's not. Instead, parents are similarly making these calculations. They are moving towards in-group belonging. And this social exercise is not well explained by cognitivist perspectives on risk assessment. Instead, Annette Beyer, the moral theorist, was correct when she described trust as cognitive as well as affective and conative. That's acting purposefully. Now, moving to trust within scientific communities, science, of course, is thought to be rigorous by being wary of trust. You don't listen to authority, you examine the evidence for yourself. That is the popular understanding of science, and it made an alternative thesis that came out of science studies starting around the 1980s very radical. The idea was that trust relations make scientific progress possible. So against the Enlightenment ideals of epistemic individualism and radical skepticism, where you study for yourself and you trust no one, a compelling case was made for epistemic dependency and trust in science. Scientists trust in the peer-reviewed knowledge that support their own work. They trust their collaborators to do each piece of the project properly. No one has the time or expertise to do all the work themselves or to check every claim. And this is not to say that hard data and logical argument are not necessary, but since not every scientist can do the singular effort of testing each claim, much of what we consider science is built on relations of trust. This should sound familiar to many of you, the argument made by John Hardwick and a few supporting people cited on the screen here. So against that lone genius image, science today is a collaborative exercise of partnerships and relationships of trust operating between actors and between institutions. And they operate most of the time invisibly in order to keep science going. So behind the scenes, trust operates in establishing and legitimating knowledge as true for everyone. Now, leave scientific communities and move to the public stage. This is the site where vaccine controversy takes place. When you move from scientific communities to relationships between science and the public, epistemic dependency and trust in experts are actually more visible and more obvious. Members of the public rely on scientific knowledge to inform all kinds of choices, everyday choices and practices. We, the public, don't have the time or skill to check each claim for ourselves, so we will often look to experts for advice. And when the channels of knowledge translation and knowledge mobilization work well, this move from expert advice to non-expert action goes smoothly. But we're talking about vaccine hesitancy today because relations between experts and non-experts are not so secure. Members of the public are arguably well advised to defer to scientists with relevant expertise. These scientists have the interactional expertise that makes their judgments more likely to be right, more likely than our own as non-experts. So I think we all agree that the public benefits from well-placed trust in experts. The challenge is knowing when that trust is well-placed. The risk of harm, of being misled, remains. Of course, we try to reduce that risk by assessing expert advice. We may not be qualified to assess the content of scientific claims, but we can evaluate the character of the scientific expert or the integrity of the institutions that the scientist represents. And that's what people do. Members of the public will follow expert advice if we trust those experts to be both epistemically and morally responsible. So the rationality of following expert advice hinges on trust and on credibility. Experts must be trustworthy and non-experts must recognize them as such. So relations of trust do mediate successful exchanges between scientific institutions and the public. Now, of course, relations of trust don't preclude disagreement and controversy. In scientific communities, dissent between members is expected, and it's even encouraged. Trust, of course, is what helps manage those disagreements and dissents. The avenues for managing dissent and disagreement follow from a generally accepted democratic orientation towards truth-seeking and consensus building, one that is both public and accountable. Social epistemologists view these mechanisms very favorably and even make recommendations to improve the democratic tenor of science, the idea being that more democracy will make science better. For example, increasing diversity in scientific communities that will make dissent and criticism more robust, limiting spurious dissent that is meant to be obstructionist rather than knowledge-seeking. In their recent book, DeMello, Martin, and Intimate think these efforts to regulate dissent will ultimately fail, but that doesn't stop people from trying. It's with these communicative practices in place that robust scientific consensus can arise on some issues, while points of disagreements can still respectfully endure without rupturing community cohesion. Now, compare that to public controversies over science, not so well managed. We don't have comparable shared rules for the management of disagreement and for consensus building. There are no shared frames of references. Instead, we've got facts and alternative facts and which one is legitimate science and which one is junk science. We often have conflicts of interest, especially financial, on both sides. The science controversy, as if that's not enough, that's already a lot. The science controversy usually isn't about science at all, but what follows practically from accepting the science as true. What policies will be put in place? How will they impact my livelihood and sense of well-being? Dan Sarowitz has argued this point, and Dan Hicks has described science controversies as proxy politics for that reason. And this can be a hard realization for some, that science can't guide us to good policy and right action, that science doesn't neutralize political partisanship and rationalize democratic decision-making. It is really shocking to many vaccine advocates that the scientific consensus on vaccines does not settle public concern. It's supposed to, after all. That's one reason we do scientific consensus statements. Instead, the consensus gets positioned on one side of a debate where scientific experts must insist on their legitimacy against disreputable opponents who claim to have science and moral credibility on their side. So we should appreciate that surprise. The consensus, of course, functions to settle debate, not invited by representing the majority view of those most suited to pronounce on the issue. The failure to achieve these aims is no doubt frustrating. Many will ask, doesn't the consensus deserve more deference? Naomi Oreskes has written a whole book on this. The consensus is, after all, the best approximation of scientific truth. It's produced by the best of science's truth-seeking procedures and practices. So the universal applicability of its findings rest in the methods of consensus building. For the public to suggest impartiality in the consensus statement is to reject an elaborate set of epistemic, methodological, and institutional mechanisms that are meant to ensure reliable knowledge and public benefit from that knowledge. Science isn't supposed to be something that you believe in or are against. To say otherwise is to suggest that is to say that science depends on trust. Now, of course, science does depend on trust. So what's important here is that much of what members of the public know about vaccines pivots on epistemic trust. That same point has been argued about our beliefs on climate change. Ben Almasi wrote a paper on this in 2012. Now, tied into the consensus statements and position papers are a claim to the epistemic and moral legitimacy of its authors and the institutions they belong to. Vaccine hesitators and, of course, more strident vaccine refusers reject those claims of legitimacy. So what is the appropriate response when the consensus does not fulfill its function of engendering public trust? What happens now is that vaccine hesitators and refusers are ridiculed for raising concerns, for questioning expert testimony, and for taking seriously minority dissenting opinion. Against this democratic tenor of science that I just spoke about, science journalists write articles like "Why You Have No Business Challenging Scientific Experts" to convey their sincere disgust over the current state of affairs. They ask why, in this article, there's the sort of incredulous question, why would you take the word of a media-savvy celebrity mom who attributed her knowledge of autism to the University of Google over many expert scientists? Now, we know that the consensus is an expert-generated directive for epistemically dependent outsiders. It's meant to offer the scientific information we need to know. Yet the mechanisms used to ensure the trustworthiness of that information, things like the negotiation of conflicting views, at conferences and in journals, the replication of finding, peer-reviewed, and so on. These are largely internal to the scientific community and thereby shielded from public view. And so that final step in the expert-lay exchange, where if all goes well, the publics accept the scientific consensus view, requires some degree of a trusting leap of faith that the scientific experts have done their due diligence and reported responsibly. that the trust requirement places the outsider in a vulnerable position, and there's no sympathy for that. The publics are implored to trust science, trust in a process whose trustworthiness lies in it being shielded from public opinion and other non-expert contributions. So without an eye on or participation in the innermost practices of scientific knowledge and consensus building, and also with various threats of sanction for not accepting the findings, the publics are instructed to trust, and some are not willing to do so. Decision-making on vaccines is difficult. People get caught up in a noisy confusion of competing claims, alternative voices with various expertise, social media amplification, and many parents report feeling genuinely unsure about how to support their children's health. Same story with adult health during COVID. Now, while those dissenting and questioning and confusing voices do make the decision-making process more difficult, it is due to poor trust in institutions. It's due to poor trust in those institutions that those very bodies tasked with protecting the public good are not able to carry out their mandate by guiding parents out of the fray, guiding parents out of the confusion and offering the definitive voice of reason. So the consensus does not fulfill its function here of guidance. And there are implications for this that go well beyond individual choice and the epistemic abilities of the public. Everyone seems to agree that the public needs science, but my point is that it goes both ways. Science needs the public too. The fulfillment of many institutional mandates hinge on positive public relations. Science, of course, strives to create universally applicable knowledge, and this knowledge is universal only insofar as it is accepted by various stakeholders. So this places a demand on scientific communities to earn and maintain the trust of their stakeholders, and those stakeholders include the publics. Research institutions that do more esoteric work at minimum need public trust in order to access research funds and to be able to do their work with minimal interference. Policy relevant science, that's research motivated by practical goals like furthering human welfare or animal and environmental health and welfare, they have more elaborate ties to the public. So that stakeholder relationship is more complex. These practical goals of policy relevant science requires that its scientific claims be accepted by stakeholders that are not part of specialized epistemic communities. Policy relevant science can only provide those public benefits if the institutions are regarded as trustworthy by members of the public. For example, public health, you can only improve population health if the publics accept and follow the recommendations. Health recommendations, of course, bank on the public's trust in these institutions' integrity or the view of them as conscientious and honest efforts to inform and protect the public. So offering the best science and the most carefully considered directives are really not enough. The science, of course, needs to be trustworthy, but it also needs to be trusted by all public health stakeholders. It needs to be credible. So persistent vaccine hesitancy suggests that there's an institutional failure to earn and maintain the public's trust. And that warrants some self-reflection about these institutions and agencies' very own trust-building practices. Now, I'm going to wrap it up now. I've argued that the evidence most of the public accept on vaccines turns crucially on epistemic trust. And it is poor trust in expert sources that invoke vaccine hesitancy. So in other words, consensus claims won't convince if its source is not perceived as trustworthy. So what if we focused on building that trust rather than educating the misinformed publics or puzzling over the moral and epistemic failings of the public? Not an easy task, but what if that was the focus? Doing this does not discount that public health agencies have the science on their side, but it does mean that the best science is not enough. This is not a war with the public. It's not a war over science. I've offered a different picture of science in relation to the public than that firm anchor mooring liberal democratic political organizations. I think science should still be understood to hold firm ground, but the idea that the evidence somehow speaks or dictates right policy is certainly a fiction. For all the language of follow the science during our many months of COVID, I think we see that that's more platitude than anything else. And that's partly because even settled science has evidence that is subject to interpretation, and political and policy decision-making requires numerous non-scientific considerations. So scientific evidence operates within a constellation of social influence that guide personal decision-making and policy formation. And it's good trust relations that ensure that science stands prominently within policy frameworks. For that reason, good relations with the public need to be maintained, not as a secondary interest, but as a primary interest for doing public health. The current tendency of criticizing the skeptical publics for failing to appreciate the primacy of scientific reasoning or the authority of experts really doesn't address the problem of public mistrust of scientific institutions. If anything, it exacerbates the mistrust by entrenching a polarizing us versus them mentality. Okay, that's it for me. Thank you very much. Looking forward to your questions.
Maya, that was absolutely fascinating. And I'm delighted that your book is out at this time, as there's so many relevant pieces in there. You know, it's most certainly a book for our time. So thank you for your wonderful contribution today. We've lots of questions from the very large audience with us today here on Zoom and online via YouTube. I think I'll start with, so in every country, I think there's sort of one relatively new public figure who is the face of the science, right? In Ireland, it's our chief medical officer, and he's a household name. And I suspect there is a similar person in Canada and in every other country from where people are listening. I know they're not all the same, and they all come from slightly different backgrounds. But they kind of have to go in and speak truth to power regularly about what's going on. And it's been to varying successes. You can see from all the way from, suppose, Sweden on one side of the spectrum to New Zealand on the other. What would you say to them at this hopefully late stage in the pandemic? What advice would you give to them as we are in this chapter of COVID-19?
The kind of struggles that I've been watching those chief medical officers in Canada and abroad throughout the pandemic, and I think your research group has probably done the same, because I mean, first, let's acknowledge that this is a strange time when people can actually name their chief public health, or we call them chief medical officers in Canada, that they've become household names. And it was also an interesting phenomena where early on in the pandemic, many of our national leaders chose to sort of stand back during the press conferences and let their chief scientists speak. And I think that had to do with this. They'd clearly done some market research, and they said, people want you to follow the science. That's why follow the science became such a phrase. And one way to do it was to stand back and let the scientists speak. Now, of course, anyone that is interested in science and values in science and policy know that it doesn't work that way. Scientists do not speak and policy just follows. It was more of an imagination for the public to say, we are doing science, we are following science, which means we are doing it right. But when science, of course, is as emergent and unsettled as it was, you know, we had chief medical officers and, you know, dozens and dozens of experts saying different things about everything. It's a good time for the philosophy of disagreement too. So it was probably worthwhile for some of these chief medical officers who I've seen struggle in the public limelight to be clear about what, and clear to the public about what their role is vis-a-vis science critic, or where they're supposed to be advising and therefore allowed to be critical of government policy, but also they are, of course, an arm of the government where they're supposed to be working with the politicians, not working against them. So anyone who became too critical of their national leadership had to step away from that role. So this was probably a time where the exact relationship between science and politics within government advisory structures needed to be clearer, both to the public and perhaps to the people doing this kind of work.
Yeah, that's great advice. I hope some of them get to hear it. It strikes me that in those early days, our CMO was depicted as a Superman character on a public mural. And of course, things became far more complicated in the following months. And that's when, I think we started to hear other voices. And I really like, a huge divergence of opinion from experts. And my colleague Kieran Sugrue says, did we have too many experts commenting in the public media located in a variety of different disciplines for COVID-19, thus enabling publics perhaps to adopt a view of a plague on all of your houses, thus undermining their claims to expertise in the process? So should there have been one voice, or is this plurality of views just to be accepted? And how does the public maintain trust in that, in that plurality?
Oh, what a good question. I'm not going to be able to give a satisfying answer, because we'd first have to ask who is the right expert, who has the expertise to pronounce on pandemic response. And there's been some writing about this, so I'm not the first to say it, but the pandemic is multiple. It's certainly a pandemic related to an infectious disease and a troublesome virus, but epidemiology cannot resolve all of this. Instead, we've got concerns that go all the way from children's mental health to animal welfare to economics too. So everyone does have a say. Now, I do appreciate the way sociologists of expertise have tried to sort of partition who gets to be an expert on what. So, Collins and Evans are examples of this, to say, okay, if you are an economist pronouncing on the harms of lockdown, it doesn't make you a health expert. You can say that you might say there will be mental health consequences of job loss and those kind of struggles. And we know that there will be health effects of unemployment and the lack of access to the things people need to survive. But that doesn't mean that economists should be saying how we need to fight a virus. They don't have that kind of insight. So it'd be nice if people were able to at least stay in their area of expertise. That would certainly be helpful. But to claim that there is one expert of something as complicated as a pandemic can't be true, because every discipline has its focus, and it's in fact often not surprising that you're hearing, let's say, economists versus virologists saying very different things about something like a lockdown.
Yeah, absolutely, and it can move into sort of challenging territories. We had this dualism of lives versus livelihoods, which it was never about that, but it was so easy to just put it into that sort of category. I'm also taken by a wonderful tweet I saw from somebody who I won't name, who said that in the beginning, everyone was an epidemiologist and everyone was an expert on epidemiology. However, moving into the pandemic, a lot of those epidemiologists started to become expert on everything else, as they were the person that the media was going to. They knew they were a safe pair of hands to put in the newspaper or on the television. How does an expert maintain their trustworthiness in such a situation? Like, do you have to be careful to stay within your lane, as it were?
I think it does, because these scientists were also getting a lot of scrutiny about their public life, their private life, and as well as everything they'd ever said on social media going back many years. So I imagine many of these scientists didn't fully appreciate how scrutinized you are as a public figure, and some got in trouble for that. And you hear things about their personal life, and they as they tried to extend, people started looking at the relationships they had, like, well, you're associating with this person, and this person might be sort of associated with some sort of radical fringe group like QAnon. So we saw all the things that you would expect that someone that's new to celebrity and public life would happen, that they get a little swept up into it. Some seem to have gotten radicalized with certain political groups. Some of them maybe loved the notoriety of being controversial or contrarian. So, nothing about that surprises me, but it's it's a good lesson on how to be a public figure and how to remain at least epistemically humble about what your area of expertise actually is.
Yes, scientists are people too, as we like to say regularly. Changing direction a little bit, a question here from Heather Douglas, one of our previous speakers. Heather says, great talk, and says, how is consensus within science supposed to be about public good as well as scientific truth? And she'd like you to say a little more on that.
Well, a good consensus statement should probably not just state what the research shows us, but the type of questions that they're looking for consensus statements on would probably capture that. Like, of course, we want to know, technical content about, let's say, climate modeling and rates of global warming. But we also need to know what is our objective and what do we want to do about it too. So I think that would be captured, Heather, in what kind of questions the consensus statements are trying to fulfill. And of course, that gets us into what kind of research gets funded. This is, of course, well-traversed area in science studies about, are we doing research in the public interest versus research for, let's say, corporate interest. And if the questions we ask are the ones that the public want to know, and the consensus statements are trying to answer those questions, well, then you've got science that is aimed at the public good.
Do you think the public good is always or has to be sort of publicly funded? If you think about where a lot of the money comes from in science now, like I know in the EU there's a strong mix between public and private sources, and I suppose I could understand some hesitancy coming from people who say profit is the motivator. I'm not sure I should trust that. Is there a difference in the trustworthiness of publicly funded science versus that's maybe a little bit more co-funded or entirely funded by the private sources?
Well, there's no reason that privately funded research wouldn't be acting in the public good. Now, the question is, so you need to be asking, does the profit motive and the public interest diverge from each other? And of course, if we have the right incentive structures, they don't need to do that. My area is biomedical research. So, I could talk at length about how, the pharmaceutical industry can and has done a lot of good to benefit the public. However, there are times when the profit motive have steered them away from those interests. Now, if the incentive structures around patents and profits were geared towards helping the publics, and there's been good work trying to come up with better incentive structures for that. If it was actually, the profit came from helping the most people, well, then you'd have a profit-driven industry that was actually doing the kind of work that the public needs. And so there shouldn't be a problem there.
Yeah, absolutely. A great question from Ilana Pasquinelli, who says, can education play a role in favoring reasonable or /wise trust in science for younger people? But she has the caveat I think is quite interesting, is what type of education? I suppose if it's something just facts, that grindy approach, I would imagine, based on what you said, you wouldn't be so keen on that. But maybe there's other things that we could learn. I'm thinking about, and I work in science teacher education. What could people like me do better to help educate scientists and educate science teachers?
There's lots of good work in science education, and usually I've noticed that the discussions usually tend to suggest we need to go a little bit broader than, of course, doing the calculations and learning the sort of standard facts are helpful, but students need an understanding about how science fits into everyday life. So that gets you more into science in relation to politics and in relation to values. And of course, teaching some history of science is helpful for that too. And we mean an accurate history of science, not those, eureka moments where everyone just realized they were wrong and now we're right. So we get a better sense of what science looks like as an emerging phenomena, so that we don't have this kind of misunderstanding when, let's say, we've got emerging science during COVID, we've got directions being changed, and people say, "What? The experts don't know what they're talking about." First, they said, "Yes, do this." Then they said, "No, don't do that." And there's this interpretation that science is supposed to be a solid and never changing. So a more accurate understanding of science and how it fits into the questions we need to ask, and that includes our political structures, would be more helpful, so that when people look out in the world and see science changing and they see that science can be politicized, it's not that need not be reason for concern, even though it can be concerning, but is actually how science operates within the broader society.
Would you agree that, like, in media portrayal of science, it's quite adversarial, almost like you take a legal position, one versus the other? And I've often felt when interacting with media about science that it's that's your position and that you've said it before, so you have to hold to that. Like, do you think the media perhaps could be better in pulling out that nuance, perhaps for us to discuss the nature of science as well as just the outputs of science?
I think so. It's hard for me to blame the individual journalists, because they do not get paid and do very much, and they don't get a lot of support for research support for the work they do. So I believe it's very hard to be a journalist right now. We've also noticed during these months of COVID that a lot of non-science reporters were put onto science beats, because that's what most of the news was about. So you had people that really don't know a lot about science, don't know to ask the right questions, like, what are the limits to this study? And because of that, they were doing, reporting on, they were doing a lot of the mistakes that a well-seasoned science journalists know not to do. Don't just report on a mouse study, don't sensationalize one study, ask for a variety of opinions. There's all kinds of, like, how to do good scientific reporting, and that was not happening during COVID, just because I think the deadlines were tight and and many journalists were untrained. But there are good journalists out there, and there's even training sessions on how to report responsibly on scientific findings.
And we might come back to the role of science communicators in a moment, but Brian Trench asks, he says, greatly appreciate your critique of the narrative around literacy and illiteracy and your detailed discussion of dimensions of trust. But where is the crisis of trust to which you referred when surveys indicate levels of trust in science are stable? I have seen so many surveys. The answer to that is I don't know exactly what to think about these surveys anymore. I guess we would need some kind of meta-analysis of all the different survey questions. Some show stability. Others say there's some suggestion that those kind of broad studies that show, relative stable over, let's say, a 20-year period don't capture the important nuance where there are pockets of society that are very untrusting. So they might fluctuate up and down, even though the general stays fairly consistent. And we also, for every survey that I've seen that says science is doing fine, I see others that say science is not fine. So I need a social science methodologist to help me with this, but I don't know what to make of these surveys. They seem to say everything about science. Yeah. So public attitudes of science, excuse me. Do you think there's geographical spread, perhaps? Like, I suppose if you were to look, say, in Ireland at the moment, we enjoy a very high uptake of COVID vaccine. Now, there was discussion at early stages about the good vaccine versus the not so good vaccine when we were offered vaccines dependent on age group, and that led to discussion. But we're kind of patting ourselves on the back here, saying we trust science there, and that's why we took the vaccine. I don't know if that's true, but that's the narrative that's being put out.
That's the narrative, but all of the research suggests that people will take the vaccine if they trust the government. It's actually got more to do with in the stability and ability of the governing structures. Of course, our scientific institutions are part of that governance, but it's not belief in science as in that thing out there that invents things and helps us live better lives, but it's actually the on the ground scientific institutions and the government that regulates these vaccines and brings them to the people. So that is actually quite stable, and that's not just unique to COVID. It was true of uptake of the H1N1 vaccine throughout Europe. It was true of Ebola uptake in the pockets of Ebola countries. So it's actually got more to do with sort of political comfort with the political structures more so than anything. And people kind of, when people talk about that, they pointed to sort of the U.S. as the most as a good way to sort of see that division where the COVID vaccines were the Biden things.
Oh yeah,
While if you were a Trump supporter and thought that he'd lost the election, then you were not going to get that. And of course, not everyone's going to do what they say with these surveys, but you could see the sort of political ideology mix into this sense of security around vaccines.
So, like, as a follow-up, why doesn't that hold then universally for all socioscientific issues? So, whilst we have a really high uptake of COVID vaccine, we didn't have that for other vaccines in the past, and there are other socioscientific issues where that trust doesn't seem to be there, or maybe there hasn't been the space for it to be established. Have you any comments on how different issues can have different degrees of trust?
I can comment on the sort of unique political nature of vaccination and vaccine hesitancy. That's why, I started this work as a philosopher of science, but it ended up much more looking at, the social dimensions and political considerations more than I thought I would, rather than, a weight of evidence kind of analysis. Vaccines have always been tied to cultural anxieties or whatever the current fears of the time. You can do sort of history of vaccines and say whatever people were afraid of at this point, they tied vaccines to it. And because of that, it spoke to something about vaccines, probably because they are often tied with mandates. The uptake and the appreciation of them are always tied to what's going on socially and politically between individuals and between communities, and not just whether you understand what mRNA is or something like that. So there are other scientific technologies that don't elicit that kind of political response, just because they can be more removed from, the lives that people are living.
Just a few more, because I'm conscious of your time, but these are wonderful questions, and I think I know we've had great topics so far, but this one seems so pertinent at the moment. We have a great question from David Amirian, who says, unfortunately, not in all societies, absolute majority of experts believe in vaccine safety and effectiveness, which is a quite challenging situation in building public trust regarding those vaccines. In many former USSR societies, people don't believe so-called optimistic experts, but easily believe the more pessimistic ones. Are there recommendations for such situations? And David, thanks you for your wonderful lecture.
Thanks so much for that question, David. I followed vaccine uptake in Russia. I was able to read some articles about it, and that was a sort of an interesting case study, because at least the areas that were being reported on had very, very easy access. So these were mobile buses driving up and down the countryside, and they wanted to vaccinate everyone, and they were getting no uptake. And it was specific when people actually agreed to speak to reporters. They said, we don't trust the government and we don't trust this Russian vaccine. They were very happy to get one of the foreign vaccines, but they felt that in the global race between the U.S. and Russia about who would make the vaccine first, they did not trust that it had been properly tested or regulated, and there was good reason to think that. So the fear would be, again, this speaks to the sort of political structures there, is that the experts that spoke favorably about the local vaccine were seen as maybe being paid off or scared into saying the thing that the government needed them to say and not speaking independently. And how you get past that, I'm not sure, because it is saying something specific about mistrust of government, and that is the problem there, and not somehow a disregard of experts. In fact, it's got very little to do with what they think of the experts. They might believe that the experts are not allowed to speak freely and be critical.
Thanks. That's a great response. My last question, perhaps close to my own heart, is what role is there for science communicators here? I would say science communicators in general haven't had a great pandemic. They've sort of been sidestepped a little and gone straight to the horse's mouth, as it were, looking for the expert testimony of the scientist. Of course, many people would straddle both camps. Have you any advice for those who do work as professional science communicators, and how they can act as effective intermediaries in this space?
Well, I've watched work done by science communicators trying to pick up vaccine uptake in communities that were very hesitant around the vaccines. And what was nice was, well, first, science communicators are able to, speak in, able to break down complex ideas and technical information into much more palatable things. So I follow all kinds of communicators on Twitter that make infographics and little videos to explain what might be complex technical issues. So that is appreciated for people that have those informational questions. And of course, people who hesitated about vaccines, you have to identify where they're coming from. Is it sort of rampant mistrust of government that is harder to address? Is it, little pockets of misinformation or misunderstanding about, what is this new mRNA? Is it really experimental, like that kind of thing? So that's where the science communicators can answer the more specific questions and can do it really well. And they can also tailor their advice to the community that they're speaking to. So we now speak of cultural context and trauma-informed and culturally sensitive communications around science, instead of thinking that there's just one way to say it and that's going to suit everybody. Instead, you need to speak to communities with a certain history and relationship to science, and you need to speak to those concerns, and that's how you make effective communication happen. And it needs to be done locally most of the time, and that's very good work that science communicators can do, and I've seen some of them do it very, very effectively.
Absolutely, I agree. And I guess it's also an excellent advertisement for diversity within the science community itself and the community of science communicators. Professor Goldenberg, thank you. Thank you sincerely for such a wonderful talk. Again, I would encourage many of you that have tuned in to follow up and read Maya's book if you can. It's recently published. It's well worth the read. It's very accessible and really informative for the times we live in. So thank you again for your wonderful talk.